holding second yesterday. Sansen have deported Stews. He uses a tune at saying that 18 was stood at this table. She was given in.
The sun streamed gently through the window, casting long, soft shadows across the shelter's quiet lobby. The clock ticked steadily, marking the passing seconds in this otherwise peaceful space. A woman, her face worn but hopeful, stepped in, scanning the room as the door clicked shut behind her. It was the usual routine, the kind she'd seen many times before. But today, there was something different. Sitting in the far corner of the room, a shelter dog, a quiet, unassuming creature, often overlooked, sat upright, his gaze fixed on the newcomer with unwavering focus. His posture was peculiar, almost purposeful. A slight tilt of his head, a shift in his weight, all told a story that only he understood. His fur was matted, his eyes tired, but there was an unmistakable intensity in the way he observed her. The staff, used to the regular shuffle of visitors, didn't notice at first. But the woman did. A small, knowing smile tugged at her lips as she crossed the room, her heart quietly sinking with the rhythm of the dog's stillness. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. He blinked once, then stood, his tail not wagging in excitement, but rather swaying with quiet confidence. His movement, gentle but deliberate, spoke of something deeper, something she hadn't yet fully understood. As she extended her hand, the dog took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. There was a quiet understanding in that look, a connection that felt too meaningful to dismiss. What the dog sensed would change everything. The morning light crept gently through the high windows of the shelter, casting warm, golden beams across the worn wooden floors. The faint sound of soft footsteps echoed in the silence, breaking the stillness of the early hours. It was a quiet morning at the shelter, just like any other. The staff moved through their routines, making sure the dogs were fed, their pens cleaned, and the paperwork sorted. Outside, the world continued on, indifferent to the small, forgotten lives inside these walls. Marissa, the shelter's manager, moved through the lobby, checking the list of visitors scheduled for the day. A few had canceled, some had never shown up. She sighed softly, watching the dogs in the various pens. Each had its own story, its own pain and joy, but today was no different than any other. Then, in the far corner of the room, a dog did something he'd never done before. The dog was a scruffy, medium-sized mixed breed, one of those that no one could ever quite place in terms of breed. His fur was tangled, his eyes a bit cloudy from age. He'd been at the shelter for months, overlooked by potential adopters, the kind of dog who spent more time lying quietly in his pen than trying to get attention. His name was Charlie. But today, Charlie did something that made Marissa stop in her tracks. As a woman stepped into the shelter, Charlie sat up, straight and purposeful. His eyes locked on her, intense and focused. It wasn't the kind of attention the other dogs gave. It wasn't the eager jumping and wagging of tails. No, Charlie's stance was different. It was still, like a quiet magnet, pulling the visitor toward him. The woman, a figure in her late 30s, her face soft with quiet hope, glanced around the room. The light caught in her hair, giving her a glow that matched the warmth of the morning. She hadn't been to this shelter before, and yet, there was something about her, a kind of vulnerability, a story written in the lines of her face that made Charlie watch her with such focus. For a few moments, neither the woman nor the dog moved. Marissa, still standing in the doorway, watched the strange exchange. The woman took a step forward, hesitating for just a moment, before her eyes settled on Charlie. A small smile tugged at her lips. She didn't know why, but something about the dog's gaze, steady and searching, made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. Charlie's tail remained still, but his body shifted slightly, as if giving her a silent invitation. The woman took another step, her gaze never leaving his. A moment of connection seemed to settle between them. Something in her seemed to soften. Marissa's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the same thing. There was no denying it, Charlie had never behaved like this before. The woman extended her hand slowly, as if testing the waters. Charlie didn't shy away. Instead, he took one careful step forward, his eyes still locked onto hers. The room seemed to quiet, the faint hum of the outside world growing distant. The dog's gaze softened, as if he recognized something of familiarity in the stranger standing before him. "What is it, boy?" Marissa whispered softly to herself, her breath caught in the tender silence. Charlie took another step, his body language now calm but intent. The woman's breath hitched, her eyes softening as she knelt down to meet his gaze. Then, as if by some quiet understanding, the dog reached out with his nose, lightly brushing her hand. The briefest of touches, but it felt like something monumental. What the dog sensed would change everything. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the warmth in the shelter only grew. Marissa had to remind herself to breathe, as if the connection between Charlie and the woman had somehow unsettled the usual rhythm of the shelter. The woman, who had introduced herself as Elise, sat beside Charlie's pen now, her fingers slowly scratching the back of his ears. The dog had settled beside her, his body language relaxed, but his eyes were still intent on her face, his focus unwavering. Marissa watched from across the room, her curiosity piqued. She had seen a lot of visitors come and go, some hopeful, some hesitant, some ready to adopt right away. But this was different. Charlie had always been a quiet dog. He rarely made eye contact with anyone, much less held it for this long. His usual interactions were more passive, a gentle wag of the tail if someone was lucky, a soft nudge of his head if he wanted a bit of attention. But this was something else. Elise shifted in her seat, crossing her legs as she settled into a more comfortable position, still gently stroking Charlie's fur. The dog didn't budge. He seemed to have decided, in that quiet way of his, that he would stay exactly where he was. His body was relaxed, but his eyes never left hers. Marissa took a step closer, trying not to intrude on the moment, but there was something magnetic about it, something that held her in place. Elise, sensing the quiet presence of the dog, paused for a moment and turned her gaze toward him. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" she murmured, her voice soft, a little wistful. Charlie's ears perked up at the sound of her voice. It was subtle, but it was there, the shift in his attention. He blinked slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. It was as though he were listening to something only he could hear. She smiled at him, a small, knowing smile that seemed to reach the corners of her eyes. "I think we understand each other." Her voice had a calmness to it, a softness that seemed to mirror the stillness in Charlie. For the next few minutes, nothing more was said. Elise's fingers moved in slow, circular motions on the dog's back, and Charlie leaned into her touch, his body language softening further. He didn't move to nuzzle her or demand attention. Instead, he simply settled, as if in deep thought, and allowed the quiet intimacy to grow. Marissa stood nearby, her arms crossed lightly in front of her as she watched the unfolding scene. Her mind raced with questions. What was it about Charlie that made him respond like this? He had been through so much in his life, abandoned and lost before finally coming to the shelter. He was skittish, hesitant around strangers, and yet there he was, sharing this quiet moment with Elise. For all his quiet demeanor, there was something about him that made people stop. And today, it seemed that the one person who noticed him, really noticed him, was Elise. She observed how Charlie's head turned ever so slightly as Elise leaned forward, speaking softly to him. It was such a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The dog wasn't just reacting to her touch, he was absorbing her presence. There was an awareness in the way he watched her, something more profound than mere curiosity. "Do you think he's always like this?" Elise asked, looking up at Marissa. Marissa blinked, pulling herself from her thoughts. She took a small step forward, looking at Charlie, then back to Elise. Not exactly. He's usually pretty reserved. Doesn't make too much of a fuss. She paused, her gaze softening. But I've seen him show quiet understanding before. Just not like this? Elise nodded thoughtfully, her eyes not leaving Charlie. It's like he sees something in me. Marissa watched the two of them, feeling something stir inside her. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something undeniably special about the connection unfolding in front of her. The air between them was filled with something gentle, something unspoken but understood. Charlie's tail gave the faintest of wags, not in excitement, but in a slow, deliberate movement. As if acknowledging her words, Elise's gaze softened further, her hand gently continuing its soothing strokes along his back. There was a quiet pause, and then Charlie, without warning, stood up, stretching his legs. Elise, startled by the sudden movement, looked down at him. He didn't move toward the door, didn't wander off to another corner of the room as usual. Instead, he turned and looked directly into her eyes, his expression steady and focused. Elise's breath caught in her chest, a subtle awareness blooming in her heart. There was something in the way Charlie looked at her, something familiar, something profound. And then, just as quickly, he sat down again, his gaze still locked onto her. It was as if he were saying, "I'm here, and I'm waiting." Marissa felt a small shiver down her spine. What was this dog sensing? What did he see in Elise that no one else could? Her thoughts swirled with possibilities, but she pushed them aside for the moment. Whatever it was clear that the connection between Charlie and Elise wasn't like anything she had witnessed before. And somehow, she knew this was just the beginning. The days passed quietly, each one a slow unfolding of small moments between Elise and Charlie. At first, it seemed like a passing connection, a fleeting moment of peace in an otherwise busy, noisy world. But with every visit, Elise found herself drawn deeper into the gentle rhythm of Charlie's quiet presence. She wasn't sure what it was, exactly, that called to her so strongly, but there was something about the dog that felt like home. The shelter, with its cool floors and soft lighting, had always felt a little sterile to Elise. There was nothing wrong with it, it was a safe place, a refuge for animals in need. But as the days slipped by, the walls seemed to press it a little more. The quiet hum of voices and the shuffle of feet had started to feel a bit too loud, too overwhelming. And yet, when she was near Charlie, there was nothing but stillness, the kind of stillness that soothed a person's soul. One afternoon, Elise sat on the bench next to Charlie's pen. She was there earlier than usual, hoping for a quieter moment before the shelter filled with visitors and volunteers. Charlie was lying down, his body stretched out across the cool concrete floor. He didn't look at her immediately, instead, he seemed lost in his own world, his eyes half-lidded in contentment. It was the same as always, but for some reason, Elise found herself watching him more intently. His stillness, his calm, made her think. He was always like this, so calm, so aware of the world around him. And yet, there was always something more behind his gaze, something deeper than just the surface of his quiet demeanor. Elise? Startled, Elise looked up. Marissa stood nearby, her arms crossed, a curious expression on her face. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," Marissa said, her voice warm and gentle. "I just noticed you sitting here with him. He really seems to like you." Elise smiled softly, a little embarrassed. "I don't know what it is about him. He's so different from the others. I can't explain it. It's like he understands things." She paused, wondering if her words sounded foolish. "I know that sounds silly." "No, it doesn't," Marissa replied, shaking her head slightly. "You're not the first person to say that about him." Elise blinked in surprise. "Really?" Marissa nodded, moving closer to sit beside her. "Charlie's always been a quiet one. He doesn't jump around or beg for attention. But there's something about the way he watches people. It's like he's listening to something no one else can hear." Elise's brow furrowed as she turned her attention back to the dog. Charlie was still lying on the floor, but his eyes were fixed on the window, his gaze distant. She took a deep breath, feeling something stir in her chest. There was something in his eyes, something that made her heart ache with an unfamiliar emotion. He wasn't just a dog. He wasn't just a shelter resident waiting for a family. There was more to him, something deeper than the surface. "I've noticed that too," Elise said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He watches me, like he's waiting for something. Like he knows. I don't know, something about me." She shook her head, as if trying to dismiss the strange feeling that had settled in her chest. "Maybe I'm just imagining it." Marissa smiled, a soft understanding in her eyes. "I don't think you're imagining it. I've seen it too. It's hard to explain, but he's different. You're not the first person to feel that connection." Elise's gaze never left Charlie. The room around her seemed to fade into the background as she focused on the dog. His expression, though calm, seemed to shift ever so slightly, as though he was responding to something within her. "You said he's been here a while?" Elise asked. Marissa nodded. "A few months. He came in a little worse for wear, but he's always been a bit of a loner. We think he might have had a hard past. He doesn't trust easily." Elise's heart tightened at the thought. She hadn't known much about Charlie's past, but she could feel it in the way he moved, the quietness in his eyes that hinted at something unspoken. She had always been a quiet person herself, someone who sought peace and stillness. Maybe that was why Charlie's presence felt so natural to her, so comfortable. He didn't demand anything from her. He didn't need her to speak or perform. He just was. As if sensing her thoughts, Charlie slowly lifted his head, his gaze soft but steady. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Elise's breath caught in her chest as she realized something. It wasn't just that Charlie had an intuition about her, it was that she, too, had an intuition about him. She felt, deep within her, that the connection between them was more than mere happenstance. "I think he's waiting for me," she whispered, almost to herself. "I think he knows something." Marissa glanced at Elise, her expression unreadable, but there was a softness in her gaze. She didn't need to say anything. The air between them, and between Charlie and Elise, spoke volumes. Charlie's tail gave a small, slow wag, and Elise's heart fluttered. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't a leap of excitement. But it was something deeper, more meaningful than anything she had experienced before. And in that moment, Elise realized the truth. She wasn't just visiting the shelter. She was meant to be here. And maybe, just maybe, Charlie had been waiting for her all along. The days seemed to blur together, slipping past like the gentle sway of a river. Elise continued to visit the shelter every afternoon, finding herself drawn more and more to Charlie. She had told herself that she would just help out for a little while, get to know the animals, maybe even volunteer. But somewhere along the way, she found herself coming back day after day, her heart inexplicably tethered to the quiet, perceptive dog. Charlie, too, seemed to have settled into the rhythm of their time together. At first, he had been reserved, his movements slow and careful, as if unsure of her presence. But over the course of the past week, something had shifted. He would wait for her at the door of his pen, his eyes always focused on her the moment she entered the room. And when she sat down beside him, he would lean into her, his body warm against hers, a subtle sign that he had begun to trust her. Elise's own heart had begun to open, just a little at first, then more and more with each passing visit. The pain she had carried with her for so long, the weight of loneliness and uncertainty, seemed to soften when she was near Charlie. There was something about the dog's quiet presence, his calm intuition, that allowed her to breathe again, to feel the hope that she hadn't realized she'd lost. Today, the sun filtered through the windows in soft golden beams, casting shadows that danced across the floor of the shelter. Elise sat beside Charlie's pen, as she always did, but today felt different. There was a subtle sense of anticipation in the air, as if the room itself held its breath. Charlie was lying on the floor, his body stretched out lazily, his eyes half closed as he basked in the warmth. But as Elise reached out to touch his head, something unexpected happened. His tail flicked slightly, a quiet response to her touch, and his eyes opened, meeting hers with an intensity that stopped her in her tracks. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world outside the shelter seemed distant, irrelevant. In that stillness, Elise could feel something shift, something deeper than the casual bond she had expected to form. "Charlie," she whispered, her voice soft, barely audible. She couldn't explain it, but she knew in that moment that he was more than just a dog. He was a companion, a silent witness to the parts of her soul that no one else had ever seen. She slowly leaned in, pressing her forehead gently against the cool bars of his pen. His presence filled her with an unfamiliar warmth, a quiet understanding, a peace that had been missing from her life for too long. For the first time in a long while, Elise felt like she could let go. She could let the grief she had carried with her for so long settle in the depths of her heart, knowing that it would never have to define her again. Not with Charlie by her side. Marissa stepped into the room, her eyes soft with knowing. She had been watching from the doorway, a quiet observer to the unfolding connection. She cleared her throat gently, not wanting to disturb the moment, but her voice was kind as she spoke. "You know," Marissa said, her tone gentle but filled with understanding, "Charlie's been like this for a while. He's always had a way of sensing when people need him." Elise looked up, her eyes soft with emotion. "He knows things, doesn't he?" Marissa nodded, stepping closer. "He's always been the quiet one, the one who doesn't bark for attention or beg for love. But somehow, he knows what people need. He doesn't judge, and he doesn't rush. He just waits. He waits until someone's ready to understand him, and then he gives them exactly what they need." Elise felt her heart swell with a bittersweet emotion. She had never known that kind of acceptance, that kind of patience. It was as if Charlie had been waiting for her, waiting to show her something she hadn't known she was missing. "I think he's been waiting for me," Elise said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marissa looked at her with a soft smile, as if she had known all along. "Maybe. Or maybe he's been waiting for you to see him the way he sees you." For a long moment, there was only the sound of their breath and the quiet rustle of the air conditioning. Elise's fingers traced the edge of the pen, her mind racing with the realization that she had come to understand something deeply important. This wasn't just a temporary connection. It wasn't something that would fade with time. What she had with Charlie was real. And it was something she hadn't known she was missing until now. The thought lingered in her mind, a quiet truth settling in her heart. Charlie lifted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving her. His expression was soft, yet knowing, as if he had always known the path that had led them here. There was no rush, no urgency. Just a shared understanding between them. Elise smiled, a small, knowing smile that touched the corners of her eyes. She was beginning to see him, not just the dog in front of her, but the quiet companion he had always been, waiting for someone to notice. And in that moment, she knew she wasn't just helping him find a home. He had already found his place in her heart. The soft days at the shelter drifted by, the familiar routine of cleaning, feeding, and checking in with the dogs carrying on with a gentle rhythm. But for Elise, each day brought something new, something deeper. Her bond with Charlie had grown into something that couldn't easily be explained. The quiet understanding between them was becoming more than just a shared presence. It was a profound connection that felt like it had always existed, waiting patiently beneath the surface of both their lives. Charlie, for his part, had begun to show more of himself. The dog who had once been reserved, who sat still in his pen and kept his distance from everyone, was now responding to her in ways that felt deliberate. It wasn't just the way he would sit by her side, or lean into her touch. It was more than that. His actions were purposeful, like he was showing her something, guiding her without words. One afternoon, Elise arrived at the shelter earlier than usual. She had been losing track of time lately, her visits to the shelter taking on a quiet urgency, as if she were trying to fill a space inside her that had been empty for far too long. When she walked through the door, Charlie was already sitting up in his pen, watching the entrance intently, his eyes fixed on her. It was the same focused look he always had when she arrived, but today, it felt different. There was something more in his gaze, a kind of knowing, as if he were aware of something she hadn't yet understood. "Hey there, Charlie," Elise whispered, a small smile tugging at her lips. The words felt natural, easy, even though the bond between them had grown deeper than she ever anticipated. She moved toward his pen, feeling the familiar warmth of anticipation in her chest. Charlie didn't immediately approach, though. Instead, he remained still, his tail resting against the floor, his eyes unblinking as he watched her every movement. Elise felt a shift in the air, a quiet tension that she couldn't quite place. Something was different, something was about to change, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She sat down on the bench beside his pen, her eyes never leaving his. Charlie had always been quiet and contemplative, but today, he seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for her to notice something important. "Are you trying to tell me something?" Elise asked softly, almost teasing, though the question held more weight than she realized. She looked down at the floor for a moment, collecting her thoughts, before she glanced back at him. "I wish I knew what it was." For a long moment, there was only silence between them. But then, Charlie stood up, a slow and deliberate movement. He turned his body in a precise arc and walked toward the back of his pen, near the corner where a small blanket lay. Elise watched him, her heart beginning to race. Charlie wasn't just moving in his usual pattern. He was going to the corner, a place he never went, never even seemed to care about. He nudged at the blanket with his nose, pushing it aside carefully as though revealing something hidden underneath. Elise stood, her curiosity piqued. She moved toward the pen, trying not to intrude too much on the quiet moment. Charlie stepped aside just enough to let her see what was underneath the blanket. For a moment, Elise's breath caught in her throat. There, tucked into the folds of the fabric, was a small, worn-out collar. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, and there was something familiar about it, as if she had seen it before. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked down at Charlie, who was now sitting back against the pen wall, watching her with those steady, unwavering eyes. It was as though he was waiting for her to understand, waiting for her to make the connection. "Charlie," she murmured, her voice soft and uncertain. "Where did this come from?" The collar was frayed, its edges worn smooth by years of use, but it seemed strangely out of place in the shelter. Elise felt an unexpected weight in her chest as she crouched down beside it, her fingers brushing over the familiar leather. It didn't make sense. As she held the collar, she realized that it wasn't just the object that felt significant, it was the way Charlie had led her to it, how he had purposefully nudged aside the blanket to reveal it. The connection between them was beginning to unravel in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. She looked at Charlie again, his eyes still locked onto hers. There was something in his gaze, something almost apologetic. And for the first time, Elise wondered if this wasn't just a connection between two souls in need of healing. It was more. It was something that went deeper, something tied to Charlie's past, a past that was beginning to surface. Elise felt a soft rush of emotion flood her chest, a mix of sympathy and awe. She slowly stood up, the collar still in her hand, and sat back down on the bench. Her heart was racing, but there was also a quiet understanding settling into her bones. "Did you belong to someone else?" she whispered to Charlie, her voice thick with emotion. "Was this yours before?" The dog didn't answer, of course. But the way he turned his head toward the window, his eyes distant for a moment, made her wonder if he was remembering something too, something he couldn't quite reach, but that had shaped him in ways that no one could fully understand. Marissa, who had been quietly watching from the doorway, entered the room, her expression soft as she approached Elise. "You found it, didn't you?" Marissa said quietly. Elise nodded, her fingers still clutching the collar, her mind racing. "I don't understand. This collar. It feels like it's important. Like he's been trying to tell me something." Marissa took a step closer, her eyes gently scanning Charlie. "It's not surprising. Charlie's been through a lot. The collar belonged to someone who loved him once, long before he came to us. I don't know all the details, but I do know that it's a part of his story. And now, maybe it's part of yours too." Elise's heart tightened. She had always felt a pull toward Charlie, but now it felt deeper than ever. He wasn't just a dog in need of a home. He was a dog with a history, a story that had yet to be fully told. And somehow, Elise knew that it was a story she was meant to uncover, one piece at a time. She looked down at the collar in her hands, then back at Charlie. There was a quiet resolve in her eyes now. She wasn't just here to help him find a home. She was here to help him find peace, and in doing so, find peace for herself. The quiet that followed Elise's discovery of Charlie's collar lingered in the air like an unanswered question. Every day, Elise returned to the shelter, more drawn to Charlie than she had ever anticipated. The dog had become more than just an animal to care for. He had become a companion, a silent witness to her unspoken thoughts and emotions. But now, there was a new layer to their connection, one that felt heavier, more meaningful. It wasn't just about the comfort they gave one another. It was about understanding the depths of each other's pasts, about healing from something broken. Elise found herself thinking about the collar more than she liked to admit. Every time she touched it, every time she held it in her hands, a quiet sadness settled over her. It was as if the collar carried a piece of Charlie's history, a history he could never fully explain, and yet somehow, he was showing her. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Elise arrived at the shelter, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the room in soft golden light. The shelter was quieter than usual, the late afternoon lull settling over the space like a blanket. The other dogs, tired from the day's events, rested in their pens. Charlie was lying in his usual spot, eyes half closed but still aware of her presence. She moved toward his pen, holding the collar in her hands. She wasn't sure why, but it felt right to bring it with her today. It was as though the collar was a bridge between their worlds, a way for her to understand him more fully. As she knelt beside the pen, Charlie lifted his head, his eyes immediately meeting hers, soft and steady. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to make the first move. Elise, heart racing, took a deep breath and held the collar out toward Charlie. "Do you remember this?" she asked quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "Was this the collar of the person who loved you before?" Charlie didn't respond immediately, but there was something in the way his eyes softened that made her heart skip a beat. He looked at the collar, then back at her, his gaze never wavering. Slowly, he rose to his feet and walked toward her. It was a slow, purposeful movement, as if he had made a decision in that quiet moment. When he reached the bars of his pen, he paused, his head tilting slightly as he studied the collar in her hand. And then, without warning, he leaned his head toward her, brushing against the bars as if to touch the collar himself. Elise's breath caught in her throat. There was something in that gesture, something tender and knowing, as though he were trying to tell her something that words could never express. "I think you've been trying to tell me something all along, haven't you?" Elise murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Charlie's tail gave a slow, gentle wag, and Elise felt the flood of emotions overwhelm her all at once. She had been so focused on her own healing, on finding a way forward, that she hadn't fully understood how deeply Charlie's past was woven into the fabric of their connection. He wasn't just a dog who needed saving, he was a dog with a story, with a past that had shaped him, just as her own past had shaped her. She stood slowly, her heart full. The bond between them had shifted again, deepened in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about finding peace with him. It was about understanding the ways in which they could help one another heal, both from the quiet hurts they had carried for so long. Elise turned to Marissa, who had entered the room quietly, watching the interaction between them. She had been watching from a distance for the past few days, and it was clear she had sensed the change in Charlie's behavior as well. "It's almost like he's sharing his past with me," Elise said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like he's letting me in. He's letting me know what happened to him." Marissa nodded, her expression soft but knowing. "I think you're right. Charlie doesn't speak with words, but he speaks with his actions. He's been trying to share his story with you, in the only way he knows how." Elise stood there, the collar still in her hand, as she looked down at Charlie. The dog had settled back down, his eyes half-lidded but still following her every movement. There was a quiet contentment in the way he lay there, as though he was no longer burdened by the weight of his past, but was simply waiting for the right moment to move forward. Elise sat down beside him, her fingers gently stroking his fur. "I don't know what happened before you came here, Charlie," she whispered, her voice steady now, "but I know this, whatever it was, I'm here now. And we'll figure it out together." Charlie lifted his head once more, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to affirm her words. His gaze was full of understanding, as though he knew, in that quiet way of his, that they were about to embark on a new chapter together. The connection between them, once fragile and tentative, was now stronger than ever. Elise wasn't sure where the road would lead, but she knew that, for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to walk it. Not just for herself, but for Charlie too. As the evening light began to fade, the soft silence of the shelter enveloped them both. There was no rush, no need for words. Just a quiet understanding that they had found something precious, something more than either of them had expected. And as the door to the shelter closed behind her later that night, Elise realized that Charlie hadn't just found a home. He had found a partner in her. And together, they would face whatever came next, not alone, but side by side. The days that followed seemed to pass in a blur of quiet moments. Elise's bond with Charlie grew even stronger, each visit feeling more like a step towards something deep and unspoken. But despite the closeness they shared, a part of her still felt uncertain. The collar, a symbol of Charlie's past, had opened a door, but there was still so much she didn't know, so much she needed to understand. It was as if Charlie's silence held a story, one he couldn't tell with words but was trying to convey through his actions. Elise found herself thinking about the collar constantly, holding it in her hands when she arrived at the shelter and feeling its worn edges. She had asked herself more times than she could count where it had come from, who had given it to Charlie, and why he had kept it hidden away. She knew that Charlie had been through something before, something that had shaped him in ways that no one could see, and now, she was beginning to realize that she had to help him uncover those layers, just as much as he was helping her uncover her own. One afternoon, after a particularly quiet morning at work, Elise arrived at the shelter with a sense of resolve. She had been mulling over the idea of reaching out to the shelter's records, hoping to find any information about Charlie's history. The mystery of the collar had lingered long enough, and something inside her told her that the answers might be closer than she thought. When she entered the shelter, the usual calm greeted her. Charlie was sitting in his pen, just as he always was, waiting for her. But today, there was something different. He wasn't looking at her with his usual steady gaze. Instead, he was staring at the far corner of the room, his eyes fixed on something unseen, a far-off look that suggested he was lost in thought. "Elise," Marissa called softly from across the room, her voice gentle but tinged with a note of urgency. "There's something you should see." Elise's heart skipped a beat as she walked over to Marissa, who was standing near the office door, holding a thick manila folder in her hands. The folder was old, the edges yellowed with age, and it looked like it had been sitting untouched for a long time. "What is it?" Elise asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Marissa handed her the folder with a soft, almost reluctant expression. "I think this is something you've been looking for." Elise's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Inside, there were several pages of notes, along with a few photographs. The photographs were black and white, slightly faded, showing a man in his 30s, standing with a small dog that looked strikingly similar to Charlie. The dog in the picture had the same quiet, contemplative expression, the same kind of stillness that Elise had come to recognize in Charlie. Her breath caught in her chest. "Who is this?" Elise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marissa leaned closer, her voice soft. This was Charlie's previous owner, a man named Thomas. He adopted Charlie from a different shelter several years ago. Thomas was a quiet man, kind but private. He lived alone, and from what we gathered, Charlie was his constant companion. But one day, Thomas stopped coming in to visit, stopped checking on Charlie, stopped answering calls. The shelter reached out, but there was no response. "We don't know what happened to him, but a few weeks later, we found out that he had passed away unexpectedly. Elise's hand hovered over the photographs, her mind reeling. And Charlie, he was left here alone? Marissa nodded slowly. Yes. He was brought back to us after Thomas passed. The staff at the time said he was confused, withdrawn. He seemed to understand something had changed, but he couldn't make sense of it. We think that's when he started becoming so reserved. He's never been the same since. Elise looked back at the photograph, her heart aching for Charlie. She had always suspected that the dog's quiet nature held more meaning than she realized. Now, it was all starting to make sense. Charlie had once had a life, a person who cared for him deeply, but that person was gone. And Charlie, in his quiet way, had been left to grieve, not in the way humans grieve, but in a way that was uniquely his own. Tears welled up in Elisa's eyes as she looked at Charlie, who had not moved from his spot. It was as if he had known all along that she would find the truth. It was as if, in his own way, he had been waiting for her to understand the depth of his pain. And now, here they were together on the cusp of healing, with the weight of his past finally coming to light. "I'm so sorry, Charlie," Elise whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't know you had lost so much." Marissa placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've done more for him than anyone else has in a long time. You've helped him find a way to open up again. You've given him a sense of safety, of belonging." Elise nodded, her fingers brushing against the worn collar that still rested in her hands. The weight of it now felt different, heavier, yet somehow comforting. She knew that Charlie had been through more than she had ever imagined, but she also knew that he had a capacity for healing, just as she did. And in that moment, she realized that their bond had not been forged out of a desire to fix each other. It had been created out of a shared need for connection, for understanding, for the quiet strength of knowing that they didn't have to be alone anymore. Charlie's tail gave a small, slow wag as he stood up and moved toward Elise. He sat beside her, his body close but not quite touching. It was as if he were offering his presence as a silent reassurance, the same quiet, steadfast presence he had always given. "I'll never be able to replace Thomas," Elise said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "But I can be here for you. We'll heal together, okay?" Charlie looked up at her with those knowing eyes, his gaze steady and full of understanding. He didn't need words. His eyes said everything. And for the first time, Elise felt like she truly understood him. She understood that, just like her, Charlie had suffered. But just like her, he was now ready to let go of the past and find peace in the present. Together, they would write the next chapter, one that was theirs to share. The morning sun streamed through the shelter's large windows, casting warm golden beams across the lobby. Elise sat in her usual spot, beside Charlie's pen, her hands resting gently on her lap. It had been a few weeks since she discovered the truth about Charlie's past. In that time, the connection between them had deepened beyond anything she could have imagined. The healing they had shared, both of them, quietly and steadily, had brought them to this moment. Charlie, now sitting quietly beside her, seemed more at ease than ever before. The hesitancy that once marked his every movement was gone, replaced by a calm serenity. His eyes, though still observant, no longer carried the same deep sadness they once had. There was a new understanding between them, a bond that neither of them had fully expected but that had grown stronger with each passing day. Elise's thoughts drifted back to the day she had learned about Charlie's previous owner, Thomas. The truth had been a weight she hadn't fully been able to carry at first, but now, it felt different. She understood that Charlie hadn't just been abandoned, he had lost someone he loved deeply, someone who had meant everything to him. And in a way, she had become that person for him again. Not to replace Thomas, but to help him find peace, to be a steady presence in his life as he had once been for her. The doors to the shelter opened, and the sound of footsteps filled the room. Elise turned her head and saw Marissa walking toward her, a soft smile on her face. "Morning," Marissa greeted, her voice warm and light. She sat down beside Elise, glancing at Charlie, who looked up at her with his usual calm gaze. "Morning," Elise replied, her voice steady, her heart full. I was just thinking about how far he's come. Marissa nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. It's amazing, isn't it? When we first got him, he was so withdrawn. I never imagined he would become so attached to someone. But I think it's clear now that he's found his place with you. Elise smiled, her heart swelling with affection for the dog who had come to mean so much to her. It's hard to believe he's the same dog sometimes. He's so much more open now, more trusting. I think he's finally letting go of the past. Marissa smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. We all have a past. We all carry our own scars, whether we realize it or not. But I think you're right. Charlie's finding a way to move forward. Elise nodded, her gaze fixed on Charlie as he lay down at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He looked so content, so at peace. It was hard to imagine the withdrawn dog he had once been, the dog who had seemed lost in his own sorrow, unable to connect with anyone. I'm glad I could be here for him, Elise said quietly, her voice full of emotion. I never thought I'd find a connection like this. It's like we were meant to find each other. Marissa's eyes twinkled with a hint of wisdom. Sometimes, the right people and the right dogs come into our lives when we least expect it. Maybe you needed him as much as he needed you. Elise thought about that for a moment, the words sinking in. She had come to the shelter initially looking for something, a way to fill the emptiness she had felt since the loss of her own family. She had hoped to make a difference in the lives of the animals, to offer them love and care. But what she hadn't anticipated was how much they, especially Charlie, would end up giving her in return. The quiet companionship, the steady presence, the way he had opened her heart again, it had changed her in ways she never expected. I guess I did, Elise murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I guess we both did. As she sat there with Charlie, a soft silence settled over them. The world outside the shelter continued its usual rhythm, but for Elise, it felt as if time had slowed, just for this moment. She was no longer alone. She had Charlie, and he had her. Marissa stood up slowly, stretching as she prepared to attend to the day's tasks. She paused and looked back at Elise with a smile. You know, Marissa said with a soft chuckle, I've seen a lot of dogs come and go. But I think you and Charlie might be the most perfect match I've ever seen. Elise looked up at Marissa, her smile full of warmth. I think so too. As Marissa walked away, Elise leaned down and gently scratched behind Charlie's ears. He looked up at her, his eyes soft with trust, and she could feel the unspoken bond between them, stronger than ever. The collar, the reminder of his past, still lay on the shelf by her desk, a silent witness to the journey they had both traveled. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a part of the story that had led them to this moment, a story that had brought them together. You've come so far, Charlie, Elise whispered, her voice filled with affection. And I've come with you, every step of the way. Charlie gave a small, quiet sigh and nuzzled her hand, a soft gesture of acknowledgement. It was as if he understood, as if he was telling her that they had reached a new chapter together, one filled with healing, understanding, and the kind of bond that only comes when two souls find each other and choose to walk side by side. The sun outside was beginning to set, casting a warm glow across the room. Elise sat back in her chair, her heart full, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. There were no more questions, no more uncertainties. She had found her place, and Charlie had found his. Together, they were a family. And as they sat there in the soft light of the evening, Elise knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, they would face it together, not as two strangers, but as companions, bound by love and by the quiet understanding that sometimes, the greatest healing comes when you're willing to open your heart and let someone in.